I am frequently asked when I stop believing in a God, or in many gods. I am frequently asked when I reach my conclusions about near-term human extinction. I am frequently asked a lot of questions that imply an epiphany on my part. I generally respond with something like, there was no such moment. I am reminded of a comedy skit by John Doerr titled, I Have Never Had an Epiphany. John is spelled Jon, and Doerr is spelled Dore. John Doerr's skit is much funnier than this presentation via video. Rarely have I experienced an epiphany. Instead, I gradually and deliberately reach a conclusion. This approach would not have suited me well had I been an early-day hunter. Once I reach a conclusion, I am quick to share it, usually because it is based on evidence rather than my intuition. This approach has not suited me well within contemporary society. I do remember an epiphany I had when I was not yet 10 years old. It came at Sunday school. My siblings and I were invited to some Sunday school by Mrs. Smith when she walked by our house as we were outside playing. Mrs. Smith was a respected member of the community, part of the family that owned the sawmill up the road from where I lived with my parents, my older brother, and my younger sister. This was in Weippe, Idaho, a village in northern Idaho. Mrs. Smith invited us just about every Sunday to go to Sunday school as she walked past our home, and we finally decided to go. My Sunday school teacher was another member of the Smith family, probably a son or a nephew of Mrs. Smith. I remember little about him except that he was nice. This story takes place during the late 1960s, when essentially all Caucasian men in Weippe, Idaho were viewed as authorities on every conceivable topic by youngsters, such as me. I looked up to this person, one of several people I called Mr. Smith, in Weippe. Anyway, back to that epiphany. William was another participant in Sunday school. He was a year older than me, and he was generally viewed as a bad boy, in and out of school. He constantly questioned authority, and he spent quite a bit of time in the principal's office for his bad behavior. My dad was the principal, so I knew quite a bit about William. During one particular session of Sunday school, William was badgering Mr. Smith about the Christian Bible used to indoctrinate us. We didn't call it indoctrination at the time, of course. Mr. Smith would explain biblical passages for us youngsters, and William would question their veracity. Ultimately, using his most authoritative voice, Mr. Smith would say something to the effect, "It is in the Bible, and therefore it is true." This made perfect sense to everybody in the class except William. The rest of us viewed William as a poorly behaved misfit. Now, of course, William is my hero. We have all been so heavily influenced by societal indoctrination that William and his ilk are difficult to find. Playing catch-up with my distant past, I encouraged and rewarded the misfit behavior demonstrated by William in the many courses I taught at various colleges and universities. Undoubtedly influenced by bad words spoken about Jerry, I misspent most of my youth trying to fit into society. A major change began when I was in my mid to late teens, as I was finishing high school. By the time I was in college, I always chose a seat at the back of the classroom. I was occasionally asked to leave the classroom because I was cracking jokes at the teacher's expense. I had become a sort of grown-up version of William. This was, and is, no cause for pride on my part. I was a jerk. I finally recognized I was a jerk when, as a graduate student, I guest lectured for a professor attending a conference. Speaking poorly and nervously to about 80 students, I saw myself scattered throughout the room. The young man in the back, reading a book, hiding behind the textbook for this class, that was me, a few years earlier. The two young women halfway up the theater-style room, passing notes to each other and chatting during the entire 50-minute period, that was me, a few years earlier. The young man in the front row, his head propped up by his hand so he could doze off as I droned on, yeah, that was me, a few years earlier. I was aghast. 10 minutes into the pathetic excuse of a lecture, I made a mental note to call all my ex-professors to issue an apology. I have not delivered on that promise I made myself more than 40 years ago. At this point, I doubt I get to it. Many of my ex-professors are already dead. I was a terrible student. My considerable talent was largely wasted, although I had a lot of fun along the way. I continue to slowly and deliberately reach conclusions based upon my evaluation of evidence. At some point, perhaps this approach will serve me well. That point had better come quickly.